So let's continue. We ended last time. With by looking at modeling climate change and using models to predict how the climate might change in the future. But let's look at how we got there in the first place. We began the whole topic looking at ecosystems. We looked at the factors that affect abundance and distribution. I've got a point by going over this again. I'll get there, don't worry. Ecosystems, and we looked at factors affecting abundance and distribution. Three main factors. There were the abiotic factors, biotic factors, abiotic factors and biotic factors. We had adaptations and we had succession. All of these form the foundation of what comes next. So we have to, as we move through the topic, we have to be constantly thinking about these things, because climate change is basically a scenario in which all of these change and are affected, which essentially therefore affects the abundance and distribution of organisms in ecosystems. So then we moved on to climate change. Understanding that climate change is in fact an abiotic factor in many ways, as climate change affects temperature, it affects rainfall, it affects soil, things like that. So light intensity even, for example. So many abiotic factors are affected by climate change. So we discussed the evidence for climate change. There were three main types: the temperature records, the peat bogs, and the dendrochronology, tree rings. You need to know how they all work, but essentially the idea there is that they provide evidence for the changing climate over time, or if that indeed has been happening. Then we looked at why the climate might be changing, so we spent a bit of time on global warming and how that occurs, and then we moved on to modeling climate change. So if global warming does happen, how do we make models that might predict where the climate's going to go in the future? So this bit is looking at the past climates, and this modeling is kind of taking us into the future and making predictions about where climate change is going to go in the future. And that's where we really stopped. And the next thing is going to be looking at the biological impact. If climate change does happen, if temperatures do change, if climatic conditions such as rainfall, light intensity in particular parts of the country or planet do change, what is going to be the biological impact of that? And even though the climate changes many factors, we'll be focusing our attention on temperature. So essentially, how would a changing climate affect ecosystems? And we look at that at the population level and at the individual organism level. Okay? Understanding that both of those things are affected basically because of the effect of temperature on single cells. Okay, so temperature affects cells. Cells make up organisms. Organisms make up populations of organisms. So if temperature affects individual cells, it's going to affect organisms. If it affects organisms, it will definitely affect populations. Okay, so this is where we are. Let's proceed. So, understanding the effects of climate change on organisms, really, if we break it down, it's going to be two things. It's going to affect species distribution, linking back to what we started with right at the beginning. It's going to affect species distribution, and it's going to affect the organism itself, its development, its life cycle, and survival chances, therefore, and therefore the population. Okay, so the one way to think about it is that these are not distinct things, it's one thing. Okay, temperature affects cells and it affects the functioning of the organism, and if the functioning of the organism is affected, it's going to affect the whole population of organisms, not just one or two. Okay, so this is how we can think, but we need to be able to think of it on these two different levels. That one, temperature can affect individual organisms, and we need to appreciate then what effect that this is going to have on a whole population of organisms. Okay, I've got a review of natural selection here from year one, understanding. I mean, and this is what I really think the context of many questions will be, is to appreciate that climate change. So any aspect, I mean, I'm generalizing here and calling it climate change. You might be asked to think about it in the context of rainfall, in the context of temperature, in the context of changing soil quality. Yeah, but as climate changes, and these things could be also influenced by that climate change, in general, climate change is effectively changing these abiotic conditions. And we said it right at the beginning of topic 5 that these abiotic conditions are effectively what organisms have formed their adaptations to. Different populations have adapted over many millions of years to, develop their own niche, their specific way to exploit their environment. And part of their environment is made up of its abiotic conditions. Okay, so these organisms have been adapting over many millions of years towards these abiotic conditions, and we can think of these abiotic conditions therefore as a selection pressure. Okay, these abiotic conditions have presented their own specific selection pressures. These organisms have been evolving over time, and now they have adaptations to overcome those selection pressures to survive and reproduce and exploit the environment and whatever challenges it presents, and resources. Okay, so, and because of that, they can survive, they can reproduce, and because of that, they have a certain population size. And here we must be referring to abundance and distribution. Okay, so I'm really trying to show you here that these concepts are just applying what we've been learning about. Okay, and you should be kind of thinking and answering questions in these terms as well. We've looked at climate change as a selection pressure, changing the abiotic conditions, and this is going to affect the population abundance and distribution. And this is the reason why I've kind of included this review slide here, which is just to remember the process of evolution, how it needs variation to begin with, links to topic 3, how that variation arises, and then this appreciation that selection pressure causes this struggle for survival, which means that those not adapted to the conditions have a reduced chance of survival, whereas those individuals that have certain alleles possibly would then have an increased chance of survival. And if you have an increased chance of survival, then those organisms are more likely to reproduce, passing on those alleles which gave them that increased chance of survival to the subsequent generation, and thus the alleles for those adaptations increase in the population. So this is linked. This is linked. So what we're saying is that, you know, this climate change is a selection pressure. Okay, and it's resulting in a reduced chance of survival because the adaptations that those organisms currently have are to abiotic conditions that are no longer there anymore because climate change has happened or is happening and is changing those conditions, and so the adaptations, so these organisms are, and this phrase comes up a lot, possibly no longer adapted. And we'll see now, as we go through this section, we'll see what that literally means. No longer being adapted. What does that actually mean in terms of the biology of, the mechanistically, like how does temperature change result in organisms no longer being adapted? Let's move on. Okay, so this is just kind of a bit of more fleshing out of what we're talking about here, that temperature, the idea of temperature being an abiotic factor, and all these other things, wind, sea levels, they all are part of this picture of the climate, and they are all also abiotic factors which are changing. Okay, this idea that climate change can be considered anthropogenic if indeed it is humans that are the cause, and that's still to be kind of substantiated or proven. But if indeed humans are the cause of the changes that result in climate change, then you have to call that abiotic factors kind of changing as a result of human activity. We have to call that an anthropogenic factor. So it's often called anthropogenic climate change, and I'll just put that there as a term, anthropogenic climate change. That's what that means. Climate change as caused by humans. So just to recap then, we kind of already discussed this, that species are adapted to their environment. They're adapted to their abiotic conditions. And if those conditions change, there's likely to be interspecific competition. So species that are adapted to their environment, those species that are adapted their abundance will remain high. Those species that are not adapted, their survival chances will become lower, and their abundance should, as a result, decrease. Okay, so that's what we're really talking about here. What are the changes in the ecosystems that could arise because of climate change, and what are the biological principles that we could use to explain that? Okay, so the better adapted species become more dominant, so we could be looking at changes in the ecosystem here. Less well adapted species can relocate if they're mobile, or if they're plants and they have a good mechanism of seed dispersal that allows the seeds to kind of grow far or germinate far away from their parent tree, then it's got a chance. Then that species has got a chance of colonizing and maintaining its population abundance in another location, which better suits their adaptations. The other thing we have to consider is climax communities. So we talked about succession being one of those factors that affected abundance and distribution. We talked about climax communities, and we said that if all other factors being equal, primary succession happens, species change over time, and eventually you go from small plants to taller plants to taller plants still to eventually trees, and it's the trees that form the climax community. But that assumes that all the kind of abiotic factors such as temperature, rainfall, soil quality, all that stuff remains constant while the climax community is there. So when you get to the climax community, there's no further change because it's kind of reached a stage where there's no further change in the abiotic factors, and so everything stays the same. However, you then change those abiotic conditions, and then you're likely to change this climax community. We said that the climax community was defined by its not changing. But if you change the abiotic conditions, you're likely to get change in the community. You're likely to get change in the community because perhaps the dominant species is now no longer adapted to the new abiotic conditions. So remember, why the climax community didn't change is because all the organisms that were there were adapted to the abiotic conditions, and the abiotic conditions were not changing anymore. But you change the abiotic conditions now, and then the rule of climax community is not changing gets broken, because now you've changed the abiotic conditions. Organisms that are adapted to the new conditions, they could become dominant now, and the species that was dominant before may no longer be dominant. Okay? Because their survival chances have gone down because they're no longer adapted to the new abiotic conditions. Okay, so the things that can happen, so the first thing that we said in response to climate change happening is that the species distribution changes. So their abundance in particular locations is affected. Okay? Simply, we encountered this example before when we looked at malaria, all the way back in those first lessons on topic 5. We looked at malaria and this idea that malaria, the parasite, was adapted to survive, and it required temperatures of around 20 degrees C and slightly above that. And whichever countries didn't have or couldn't maintain those temperatures, malaria was less abundant in those areas. But if climate change occurred, then it would allow the malaria parasite to survive in those countries, whereas previously it could not. Okay, so the change in climate causes a change in distribution of malaria as a result. And it's the same thing can happen with many other species. Okay, so, but there's an important concept here, which is, yes, we can think of species kind of migrating. That's fine, that can happen. All right, so we can think of species migrating. That's very straightforward, that species simply migrate to the places where their survival chances are higher. So it might actually be more accurate to think of organisms being, so this is let's say individuals of species A. So organisms can be in many areas. Okay, so if you think of like bacteria on food, bacteria are on our fingers, bacteria are everywhere. However, their numbers don't get too big such that we can see them unless we give them the chance to, or give them the conditions in which to really increase their population size, in which case then, so you have bacteria on food, for example, right? Now, if you have bread that goes moldy, now that mold didn't just magic out of nothing. There must have been some fungal cells already there that eventually found the right conditions and time to grow to the point where we could see the mold on the piece of bread. Okay, so the mold was already there, it just only had the right conditions for growth and time before we could see it. And in the same way, we have to be able to think about organisms even bigger organisms in a similar kind of way. So organisms can cover a large area, and they're living and dying everywhere, or in a large area. However, in the areas that suit their adaptations, they will have an increased chance of survival, and in the areas where they're present but it doesn't suit their adaptations, don't suit the conditions, then their numbers start to decrease. Okay, and similarly, numbers can fluctuate, so the numbers can go up. All right. So in the same way, now if the situation changed, for example, now I hope you can see that this is not about migration. This is just about the conditions changing, and it's the changing conditions that affects chances of survival. So organisms are already in a particular location. It's just if those conditions don't suit those organisms, then they're going to start disappearing, or their abundance is going to start going down. And in the places that do suit their adaptations, their numbers will go up or be maintained. So in the same way, we could say, right, let's say that this area, climate change causes this area's conditions to change in such a way that no longer suits their adaptations. However, in this area, the climate changes to better suit their adaptations. So what happens is that in this area, the organisms have a reduced chance of survival, and so they die and their abundance goes down. However, in this area right here, organisms, it suits their condition, it suits their adaptations, and so they survive more, and so they reproduce more, and so their abundance rises. Now I hope you can see that this is not strictly about migration. This is just about the abiotic conditions favoring survival. Okay, so that's just one concept that I would like you to think about. So we have migration, obviously, but I think in the grand scheme of things, kind of migration, I mean, unless we are talking about maybe a little bit of migration over a number of generations. So that could be one thing, that a single generation can only kind of migrate a certain distance if we're talking about kind of land-based animals, but the next generation may migrate a little bit more according to where they find their chances of survival higher, and then the next generation might migrate a little bit more. So migration, don't just think of kind of organisms waking up one day and deciding, well, over there looks a bit better, and being able to cover great distances like that. It happens probably more likely very gradually, generation by generation, unless we're talking about things like migratory birds and butterflies and things like that can cover large distances. Mosquitoes, their migration or movement might be able to cover greater distances, but it's probably a combination of the two. Okay, so on the same level as migration, we have plants. Now plants are stationary, they cannot move themselves. However, their seeds can be dispersed. Seeds can be dispersed, and this comes up quite a bit, and we need to be aware of that. Sometimes they're dispersed by wind, other times they're dispersed by animals consuming plant products, and the moving, and then at the end, at some point they excrete, and the egestion occurs, and the feces come out, and the feces contain the seeds. Okay, animal dispersal. So because of that, then seeds can end up germinating far, far away from where the original organism was. So we need to be aware of that. This can allow plants to also migrate to other places, even though it's not that particular organism. Okay, it's its offspring. Okay, can we call it offspring? Perhaps, I don't know. All right, so this is the idea, but there's a number of ways that this can happen. But remember, the driving factor is what we discussed here. Okay, that in different locations the conditions are different, and organisms are going to be more abundant in the conditions where that suit their adaptations. And they can increase their chance of survival by migrating or by seed dispersal if it's a plant. Okay, let's move on. What we have to consider now is the factors that affect that movement. So there are a number of things that might prevent migration. Okay, so this is going to have an effect on the abundance as well as the distribution, because some plants may not use wind dispersal. So it's not that all plants and trees can do this. It might be that because of human construction or human activity such as farming, animals cannot migrate from area A to area B. They simply cannot do that. And then if this area's abiotic factors do change, the animals may not be able to migrate to another place that does suit their adaptations, and therefore their abundance will have no choice but to go down. Okay? Other factors that can affect this are if trees are slow growing, then they may not be able to reproduce fast enough to cope with the changing conditions. So the conditions change faster than, so if we say that, we have a radius like this, now species A has to, there's a tree, for example, species A has to reproduce so that its seeds may allow colonization of this area, and then it has to reproduce again so that it may colonize this area. But if the climate changes faster than this process is happening, then it's like the plant then will not be able to adapt. Okay? Oh, sorry, not adapt, but it won't be able to colonize the new areas, so it won't be able to find the new areas fast enough before the changing conditions catch up to it. So even by the time that species A has got here, even this area is now not suited to its adaptations. Okay, so that's the concept there. Okay, other things then. So as we've discussed this idea that climate change will cause distributions, species distribution, to change. Okay, so we were looking from the aspect of a particular organism having to move to find the areas where its adaptations will allow it to survive. So a number of things can happen because of this changing distribution. It depends on the species. So it could be like a scenario where you have one organism, one population coming into an area that already has another population occupying that niche, for example with the squirrels, and that's going to result in competition, and whichever of the two populations is better adapted is going to outcompete the other, causing the other's abundance to decrease and possibly threatening their existence. Okay, it could be that we're talking about pathogenic organisms. Okay, so for example, we can consider the malaria to be a parasite of humans. Okay, so it could be that the climate change causes the distribution of malaria to change, which is in turn going to impact on the survival chances and the abundance of the human population. Yeah, let's ignore for 1 second the kind of health systems that we have in place to kind of counteract all this. But if we were dealing with a completely natural situation, then if we didn't have any counteracting measures, the presence of malaria in new areas would obviously affect the survival chances of the human population. Okay, and it may cause parasitic organisms to move into other areas too. So these are all the different kind of scenarios that we need to consider. Okay, so now we move on and we're just going to review what we have discussed, which I don't think is necessary. This is just reviewing what we've discussed. I think we've already discussed it to a great length, so we'll move on. Alter development. So this is really getting to the mechanism of how temperature affects organisms. So this is the other way that temperature can affect the organisms, but this is essentially how. So another way that you could look at this is how temperature affects survival of organisms and therefore populations. Population abundance. So in order to answer this question, we need to think back to year 1 and that theory that we went through regarding proteins. The fact that proteins, actually let's do it the other way. This idea that the biological processes, so all the biological processes needed for survival, biological processes for survival in a cell, in an organism, are dependent on enzymes. And remember that enzymes are proteins, and remember that proteins have a particular structure, and it's that structure that allows it to function. And the thing that we have to remember is that temperature is a factor that affects enzymes primarily because of collision rates. So remember, enzymes need to collide with their substrates in order to catalyze the reaction. So increasing temperature increases the collision rates, that's one thing. However, it also affects their structure. And when the enzyme structure is too greatly affected by the temperature, the enzyme cannot bind the substrate and cannot catalyze the reaction. So these are ideas that we covered in year 1 and which we are going to apply here. Okay, so we're going to think about this concept that if climate change occurs and one of the biotic factors, i.e. temperature, changes, how could those changed temperatures affect proteins and enzymes, and therefore how could they affect the biological processes that are needed for survival? Now we don't need to go into too much detail here, we're going to go through many examples, but the principle you must remember, so regardless of the particular scenario and example that you might encounter in the textbook, in revision, in questions, it's not really too much about those specific examples, it's about understanding this principle that temperature affects enzymes and enzymes carry out the biological processes, so the temperature is going to affect the biological processes. Okay? Possibly in a good way, possibly in a bad way. Okay? So, first we'll look at how temperature could affect plants, and we look at how primarily it's going to affect photosynthesis. And remember, photosynthesis has got a huge impact on the overall ecosystem because it affects productivity, and productivity affects how much energy goes into the whole entire ecosystem and affects the abundance of all the organisms that ultimately derive their energy from the producers. Okay, so photosynthesis, the factors that affect photosynthesis are carbon dioxide, light, water, temperature, okay? And we encounter this idea of limiting factors. Now, limiting factors is an interesting idea. What it's saying is that if you have the rate of photosynthesis in this direction, looking at the graph now, got the rate of photosynthesis here, and we're changing one variable that we know is going to impact on that rate, which is CO2 concentration. So as we increase the CO2 concentration, there's more carbon dioxide that can enter the Calvin cycle, and therefore there's more photosynthesis. But this is only true up until a certain point. So as we increase the CO2 concentration, we increase the rate of photosynthesis. But at some point, the rate of photosynthesis reaches a maximum level. Now, this is not because CO2 itself is gone too high for any reason. Okay, it's because the CO2 concentration is still increasing. So what is actually going on here? What is actually going on here? The CO2 concentration is still increases. Why has the rate of photosynthesis leveled out? Why has it plateaued? And this is the concept of the limiting factor. So what we're saying here is that CO2 obviously is not limiting. CO2 is not limiting here because its concentration is getting higher and higher and higher. But why isn't the rate of photosynthesis getting higher and higher and higher? Because it is one of the other factors that has become limiting now. Okay, so let's say we had a bar graph just showing us the levels of all the factors here. Okay, so we have light, which is a factor, we have water, which is a factor, we have temperature, which is a factor, and we have CO2. What we're saying is that at the start of the experiment, we were at this level. Okay, so at the start of the experiment, our CO2 level was very low, and so our rate of photosynthesis was low. But as we increased the CO2 concentration, the rate went up, increased it further, the rate went up, increased it further, the rate went up, increased it further, the rate went up. We increased the CO2 concentration even higher, the rate went up. We increased the concentration here now, but after we hit this point right here, any further increases in the CO2 don't give us any more increase in the rate of photosynthesis. And from this graph we can see why is because all the other factors now are lower than the CO2 concentration. So even though we're giving the plant lots of CO2, it's likely that the temperature now is not optimal, maybe there's not enough water for that, or maybe there's not enough light. So what we say here is that in this region, right here, we say that other factors have become limiting, right? And then what will happen is that if I did now, let's just increase that CO2 a bit more. Now, if I decided to increase the light, let's say I increase all of them a little bit. If I increase all of them now, then the CO2, then the rate of photosynthesis may increase. Okay? Now the more realistic scenario is this, that they're not all at the same level. But what's happened is that as we've increased the CO2 to a certain level, now something else has become limiting. So now it's the temperature that's the limiting factor because it's the lowest. Okay, so the temperature is the limiting factor. So if I increase the temperature now, then the rate is going to go up again until I get to this point. At this point, it's the water that is now limiting. Okay, so I can increase the water, and then the rate of photosynthesis will go up again until I get to this point, at which point it's the light that is the limiting factor. So if I increase the water a bit more, now it's the light that's the limiting factor. So this is the idea of the limiting factors. And when you get a graph like this, you're going to be able to think in this way. So if I were you, I'd just spend a bit of time here understanding what's going on. And do ask me the questions if it's not making sense. Before we move on, the idea that, so the enzymes have a sensitivity to the temperature. Okay, so if you increase the temperature, the enzyme will work a bit faster. But not all, so if you increase the temperature by 1 degree, enzyme A, its activity might increase by double. But enzyme B, it might increase by triple. So different enzymes have different temperature sensitivities, and this can be measured using the Q10 measurement. This is where it fits in. So this is what we're going to discuss next. All right. So out of all these limiting factors, we're going to, if you want to think of it in another way, out of all these limiting factors that could affect organisms, we're going to focus on temperature. Okay. So we're just going to do a bit of review of the basics of enzyme kinetics. I always like to break things up, break this down into 3 stages, or maybe even 2 would be okay, but actually 3 is good. Okay, so it's like a high, medium, and low type situation, right? So in the beginning, and then, so you got 1, 2, and 3, and we need to be able to explain what's going on here. So the temperature is increasing in this direction, and the enzyme activity is in that direction. So what this graph is showing us is the effect of temperature on enzyme activity. And then we look at the graph and we see that in the beginning the enzyme activity is low, but as the temperature increases, the enzyme activity increases until we get to the optimum temperature, after which further increases in temperature result in a reduction in enzyme activity. Now, if we're explaining, see here we've got low collision rate between the enzyme and the substrate. So the rate of the formation of the enzyme substrate complex at the low temperatures is low because they're not colliding as much. So you need to collide, the enzyme and substrate need to collide in order to form the enzyme substrate complex. Okay? As the temperature increases, there's increased chance of collision because the particles are moving around quicker, okay, or they're moving around more. So as the particles are moving around more, there's more chance that an enzyme will collide with a substrate and therefore form the enzyme substrate complex, which is required for the enzyme to be active. So increased chance of collision. As we approach the optimum temperature then, and as we go above that, then the temperature or the kinetic energy, the increase in kinetic energy causes the tertiary structure to change. It affects the bonds that hold the tertiary structure together, the hydrogen, ionic, disulfide, non-polar interactions. It affects those. Actually, doesn't affect the disulfide and ionic as much, but it affects those bonds holding the tertiary structure together and causes the tertiary structure to change, which means that the enzyme may no longer be complementary to the substrate. Okay, so enzyme no longer complementary to the substrate. That's a key point. And if the enzyme and substrate are no longer complementary, they're probably colliding more now than ever. But because the enzyme is no longer complementary the active site is no longer actually not enzyme, active site. Change that. Active site. The active site of the enzyme, if that's no longer complementary, it doesn't matter how many collisions are happening, the enzyme substrate complex cannot be formed and the enzyme cannot catalyze the reaction. So this is what we're talking about here, okay? So that's our basics. We've discussed that already. And now we talk about Q10 and what that can tell us. So what Q10 is really the same graph that we just looked at, except it's an appreciation that, whereas for one enzyme the graph looks like this, with this as the optimum temperature, for different enzymes, so this could be catalase from carrots, okay? So that line gives catalase, so the black line is carrot catalase, and this, the dotted line, the dashed line, is catalase from potato. Yeah? And this, how do I do that? And this might be the catalase from, I don't know, liver. Okay? And what we can do is we can compare. We can compare the sensitivities of enzymes from different species to see how sensitive they would be to climate change events. And the way we can see that is, if we look back at this graph now, the enzyme that changes most, so the enzyme that's most sensitive to, so if we've got temperature on this axis right here, temperature in degrees C, right? So you've got temperature changing in this direction. The enzyme whose activity changes the most with like a 1 degree change in temperature is the liver enzyme. Its activity changes the most with a change in temperature. The enzyme that's least sensitive to temperature changes, i.e. its activity changes the least, is potato. Yeah? So in the same space, yeah, the slope of that enzyme activity as it changes with temperature, the slope is less. So the enzyme activity is changing less as the temperature increases. So potato is less sensitive to temperature changes than liver. Yeah? So this is the comparisons that we can make. And then that's what really Q10 is. Q10 is a way to make that comparison rather than just simply looking at it by eye. Q10 gives this comparison a numerical value, which is as so. So what it's saying is it's taking a 10 degree gap and comparing the activity at those two temperatures. So if we compare these three enzymes so what it says is the activity at 30. So what's the activity of the red enzyme at activity 30 versus 20? So what's the difference? Okay, so what's the fold difference? So what we would do is, for the red enzyme, we would say that the Q10 for that enzyme is and we're looking at this equation right here, the Q10 for that enzyme, how sensitive is it to the temperature, is the activity at 30 divided by the activity at 20. So I would say 1 divided by 1 equals 1. So that enzyme has a Q10 of 1 equals Q10. So this is for the red enzyme. Right? So now we look at the data for a different enzyme. We look at the dark blue one. Dark blue. So we look at its activity at 30, which is 4. Divide that by the activity at 20, so with a 10 degree gap. And its activity is 2, so it has a Q10 of 2. Okay, so we would say that the dark blue enzyme is more sensitive to the temperature change of 10 degrees than the red enzyme, which bears out from the data. If you look at the red enzyme, its activity is not different at 20 degrees and 30 degrees, so it's not affected by temperature. Whereas the dark blue enzyme, it's much more active at 30 degrees than it is at 20 degrees. So it is sensitive to temperature. And we go one step further. If we now compare the light blue enzyme, okay, the light blue, its activity at 30 is 9, and its activity at 20 is 3. So it has a Q10 of 3. So it is the most sensitive to temperature. And we can see that as we go from 20 to 30, it's the enzyme that has the biggest change in activity. So basically that's what this equation is saying. It's just comparing the activity at a particular temperature, at T1, and dividing it by the activity at that temperature minus 10 degrees. That's all it is. Okay? And the bigger that number is, the more sensitive that enzyme is to temperature. Okay? Remember how we would generate this kind of data, and that kind of links to the core practical. We would need to set up experiments where we're measuring reaction, so we're measuring some form of enzyme catalyzed reaction over time. So reaction, so we would be measuring the reaction over time. Maybe we're measuring the volume of gas collected, or maybe we're measuring the time it takes to, no, not the time, but we could be measuring color changes or whatever. And we will be doing that for one temperature and getting the initial rate of that, and doing it at another temperature and getting the initial rate, and doing it at another temperature, and then we'd plot another graph where we've got now this time temperature versus initial rate. So we've got the initial rate at temperature 1, the initial rate at temperature 2, and the initial rate at temperature 3, and we would need to plot some kind of curve to that. And then, as long as the range of temperatures is bigger than 10 degrees, we can then look at, we can just pick a temperature here and then look at 10 degrees less than that, and then see compare the initial rate at both temperatures with a gap of 10, and then divide one by the other. And that would give us our Q10. Okay, so this might take a bit of practice, which you should be given in lessons to do. Okay, let's move on. The next important idea is how we use our understanding of the fact that changing climatic conditions are going to affect organisms, including plants, and how photosynthesis is going to occur, or the rate at which it's going to occur. So what we need to understand is that there's two potential changes here. First is that just because we call it global warming doesn't mean that all parts of the Earth get hotter and drier. Can't make that assumption. Some parts of the planet will get colder as a result of overall global warming, but that might include some parts getting colder, some parts might get wetter, some parts might get drier, and so on. So we can't assume any of these changes. However, if we have to make an assumption, yes, we do assume that temperature goes up. However, we also need to remember that climate change is not just temperature, it's also to do with other factors. Carbon dioxide is going to affect photosynthesis, water availability affects photosynthesis. So this slide is just here to kind of make us consider the potential effects of climate change on photosynthesis. Primarily, because it's going to change temperature, and it's going to affect the rate of photosynthesis, because remember, and we need to state this clearly in exams if required, that photosynthesis is in part an enzyme catalyzed process. Enzymes are involved in making a significant part of that happen, and so temperature is going to affect that. And if the rate of photosynthesis is affected, remember, it's going to affect growth, and therefore, that might be kind of presented to you as measurements of biomass. So photosynthesis is going to affect growth. Growth affects productivity, and maybe productivity is what affects biomass, and that affects yields of products. And by that we mean crop yields, okay? But on the flip side of that, cooler temperatures can also reduce the rate of enzyme catalyzed processes, so we need to be also aware of that. I mean, the other thing that we need to consider is that the temperature increases affects different places in different ways. For example, we have a relatively, say, cool region. Change the color here. We have a relatively cool region here, okay, and nearby we have a relatively hotter region nearby. Okay, so what we're saying is that if the hot place, if the temperature increases even further, we could be looking at enzymes denaturing. If the temperature is already hot and the temperature is increasing further, we could be looking at enzymes denaturing, and therefore productivity and photosynthesis included in that. We don't want to talk about every single thing all over again. But enzymes denaturing could reduce productivity in these places. On the other hand, if it's relatively cool somewhere, we could be talking about reaching, increasing collisions, increasing enzyme activity, and therefore increasing productivity. So we need to be aware of this, and it needs to be a factor. Obviously, another factor is, well, in this area, if it's cool and the organisms are adapted to that temperature, then increases in temperature don't necessarily have to increase productivity. If the organisms adapted to that cool temperature, increases in temperature might take it above the optimum and therefore not affect it positively. Okay, so we have to be aware of all the possibilities here and not just think in straight lines that that a particular scenario is either good or bad. We need to be open to the idea that, depending on the scenario that you might find yourself having to face in a question, in the textbook or whatever, that we need to be open to these different possibilities, that all these factors need to be taken into account. Adaptation, niche, enzymes, okay? But there should be enough clues. So say if you're in an exam question and it's not that any one of these could be the answer to that question. There's always clues in the question that point to one particular thing. So for example, let's say the question is talking about climate change, and in that particular question they're showing you data on reducing productivity. Okay, so the temperature's gone up and the productivities go down. So in that situation, can you think of an explanation? Well, there's not a lot of explanations. There's not a lot of possible explanations that could result in temperature going up but productivity going down. There's only one, and that is enzymes must be denaturing, and therefore the rate of photosynthesis is decreasing, and therefore the productivity is going down. Okay? You might be given alternative data where the temperature is going up and the productivity is going up. How are you going to explain that? Well, I've got an explanation for that too. The temperature's gone up, therefore increasing collisions, increasing enzyme activity, therefore increased photosynthesis, therefore increased productivity. So by showing you all these different options, I'm not trying to make you more confused, I'm just trying to give you more things, more kind of ammunition to use when the situation presents itself. Next. So now we talk about individual organisms and how the changing climate could be affecting them on the cellular and kind of development level. Okay, and this is really going back to what we did in topic 3, which was this idea that in order for cells to become organisms, they need to undergo the process of mitosis, and mitosis also followed by differentiation. And once you have specialized cells, those cells need to form into tissues and organs. So, I mean, overall, we call that the process of development, the process whereby a fertilized cell becomes, the embryo, and then the fetus, and then the baby, and then the child. That's the process of development. Okay? But again, what binds this all together is this very, central principle that it all relies on biological processes, and biological processes all rely on enzymes and proteins. And we know that these things are sensitive to temperature. Okay? And so we look at what are the different effects that temperature has on the development of organisms. So we've established that these developmental processes rely on enzymes. The enzymes are sensitive to temperature, and therefore the developmental processes are sensitive to climate change. And so what follows, and I'm not going to go through this, what follows is just examples of different species and how their development has been affected by temperature changes and how it could be observed. So these are examples. In an exam, you might have a different scenario. You just need to be aware that these changes can be observed by, not observed, but these changes can be explained by the central idea of the effect of temperature on enzymes and proteins and processes such as photosynthesis.